Caleb Mercer did not come to Cottonwood Creek looking for help. He came to dig a hole. The newborn Colt in his arms had not moved in 3 hours. Its legs hung loose. Its eyes were shut. Every man in town had already told him the same thing. Let it go, Caleb. Some things don't make it. He believed them. Hannah Whitaker did not. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat that July was the kind that made men mean and animals desperate. By 7 in the morning, the sun was already sitting low and heavy over the creek road, pushing down on the dry grass and the pale dust like something with intention. The cicadas had started before sunrise. They hadn't stopped. Hannah Whitaker heard the horse before she saw it. She was out behind her cabin pulling at the dry soil around what was left of her kitchen garden, trying to coax water up from roots that had long since given up hoping for rain. Her hands were dark with dirt. Her back ached. The old blue dress she wore was already damp at the collar, and it wasn't yet mid-morning. She stood pressed one hand to the small of her back and looked toward the creek road. A big sorrel horse was coming slow. Too slow for a working cowboy. The rider sat hunched slightly forward, not from laziness, but from weight. The kind of weight a man carries when something has gone wrong, and he hasn't yet decided what to do with it. Across his lap, wrapped in a flour sack blanket and cradled against his chest, was something small. Hannah shielded her eyes and watched. When the rider turned off the creek road and moved toward the flat stretch of sandy bank below the old cottonwood, she didn't go back to her garden. Something kept her standing. The man dismounted without hurrying. He tied the sorrel loose to a low branch, then knelt in the sand with the bundle still in his arms. He set it down with more gentleness than Hannah had expected from a man that size. He stood, rolled up his sleeves, and reached for the short-handled spade tied to his saddle. He started digging. Hannah crossed her arms. She watched him work. The sand was loose near the creek, and he moved fast, 3 strikes, 4 carving a shallow trench in the bank. His jaw was set. His eyes didn't lift. Then the flour sack shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. One small hoof slipped free from the edge of the blanket and hung in the air above the sand. Hannah was moving before she had decided to move. Stop. Her voice came out louder than she intended. The man's shovel paused mid-swing. He turned his head and looked at her like she had appeared from nowhere, which to him she probably had. "Ma'am?" His voice was flat, not rude, just finished with things. "Don't dig any further." Hannah was already stepping down the bank. Not yet. He straightened and turned to face her fully. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she'd first seen from a distance, with dark eyes and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He held the spade in one hand and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had made a decision and did not welcome interference. "This is my land, ma'am," he said. "Or near enough." "It's Public Creek Bank," Hannah said. She stepped around him and crouched beside the bundle on the sand without asking permission. "And that Colt is not dead." A pause. "It hasn't moved in 3 hours." His voice dropped slightly. "The mare couldn't feed him. He came out wrong. Town vet told me." "I don't care what the town vet told you." Hannah reached out and pressed 2 fingers below the colt's jaw on the soft hollow there, the way her father had showed her 20 years ago in a barn very different from any barn in this county. She stayed still. She waited. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for—" "Hush." He hushed. 5 seconds. 10. Then she felt it. Faint as a whisper through a keyhole. But there. "He has a pulse," she said. The man didn't speak. Hannah looked up at him. "His nostrils are still damp. Feel his chest, don't press, just lay your hand flat." She kept her voice even, the same way her father had taught her to speak around a frightened animal. "Calm is contagious," her father used to say. "So is panic. You choose which one you give them." The man crouched slowly. He laid a broad hand flat against the colt's ribs, and Hannah watched his face. She saw the exact moment he felt it. His expression didn't change much. Just a slight tightening around the eyes. A breath through the nose. "That could be," he started. "It's not nothing," Hannah said. He's cold, that's all. He got cold too fast and his body slowed down to protect itself. I've seen this before. My father bred horses in Harlan County. I've seen it come back from worse than this. She stood up. I need to get him inside, into the heat. The man stood too. He was looking at her with something new, now, not dismissal, not exactly suspicion, something more careful. You live here. Just up the bank, the cabin with the broken gate. His eyes moved briefly in that direction, then came back to her. You're alone out here. I am, she said. Widowed 2 winters ago. I don't need help carrying him if you're worried about the impropriety. I need your arms to lift him because he's heavier than he looks, and I'm not going to drop him trying to be polite about it. Something shifted in the man's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite. Caleb Mercer, he said. Hannah Whitaker. She was already moving to the other side of the Colt. Lift from under the hindquarters and walk straight. Don't jostle him. He did exactly as she said. Inside the cabin, the heat from the cook stove hit them both hard. Hannah had kept the fire banging all morning out of habit, more than need. Summer heat didn't require encouragement, but now she crouched and fed it fast, adding the 2 best pieces of split wood she had left, not thinking about the cost of them. Caleb stood in the center of the room with the Colt in his arms, uncertain. Set him on the rug, Hannah said. The braided one near the stove. Get him off the ground and onto something. He laid the Colt down with the same careful gentleness she'd noticed at the creek. Hannah noticed that too. She pulled the flour sack blanket free and threw it aside, then grabbed the quilt from her own bed. The good one, the one her mother had made, and pressed it around the Colt's body, tucking it snug under the belly and up over the ribs. She kept talking as she worked, not to Caleb, not quite to herself. Come on then, she said quietly. You've got more fight in you than that. I know you do. Come on. Caleb stood a few feet back. His hat was in his hands. What else do you need? He asked. Hannah looked up. He was asking seriously, not humoring her. Warm water, she said. Not hot. Warm. There's the kettle, and there's the pail by the door. Mix from both, tested on your wrist. If it doesn't sting, it's right. He moved to the stove without argument. Hannah kept working, rubbing the Colt's legs in long strokes from knee to hoof, the way circulation comes back slowly from the outside in. She worked his ears between her palms. She pressed her hands flat against his barrel and held them there steady, giving heat. From behind her she heard Caleb moving carefully around the small kitchen. The sound of water being poured, the clink of the kettle. A pause while he tested the temperature. He didn't ask her again. He just brought the bowl and set it near her knee. Thank you, she said. She dipped a cloth and laid it along the Colt's neck. Changed it. Dipped again. The room was very quiet except for the fire and the cicadas outside, and the occasional sound of Caleb settling his weight from one boot to the other. 20 minutes passed. 30. Hannah did not look at the clock. She had learned long ago that watching time only made it stretch. She kept her hands moving and her voice low, talking to the Colt, like he was already answering her, like the conversation was already underway. You had a hard beginning, she said softly. That doesn't mean you get a short story. Behind her she heard a sound she couldn't identify, couldn't quite name. She would think about it later and decide it was probably the sound of a man deciding not to say something. At the 40-minute mark, Caleb crouched down beside her. Hannah. His voice was quiet. Maybe. Not yet, she said. It's been. I know how long it's been. A pause. Then carefully. I don't want you to exhaust yourself on something that... Mr. Mercer. She didn't look at him. I will stop when he tells me to stop, not before. Another pause. Yes, ma'am, he said. She heard him stand again. Heard him walk to the window. Heard the small sounds of a man who did not know what to do with himself, but was choosing to stay anyway. That meant something to her, though she didn't say so. The Colt gasped at the 53rd minute. It was not dramatic. It was not the great heaving breath of the novels Hannah had read as a girl. It was small, a sharp, sudden intake, the chest rising hard, the nostrils flaring, the tiny body going rigid for one shocked second before it relaxed again. But it was unmistakable. Hannah sat back on her heels and pressed both hands flat on her thighs and breathed out slow. Her eyes stung. She blinked twice fast and would not allow more than that. Behind her she heard Caleb make a sound she had no name for at all. The Colt breathed again. And again. Shallow, uncertain, like a man remembering a language he hadn't spoken in years. But breathing. Steadying. Hannah turned and looked at Caleb Mercer. He was standing very still. His hat was crushed between both hands. His jaw was working slightly the way jaws do when a man is applying internal pressure to keep his face in order. His eyes were wet. I didn't say anything. She didn't either. There was nothing that needed saying yet. She turned back to the Colt and laid her hand softly on its neck. "There you are," she said. Caleb stayed another hour. He didn't ask to. He simply didn't leave, and Hannah didn't ask him to go. She mixed the Colt a weak warm mash and coaxed it with a cloth dipped and offered near his lips. Caleb watched and handed her things when she asked without turning it into a production. At some point, he refilled the kettle without being told. At another point, he went outside and came back with more wood stacked by the stove, which Hannah had not asked for and did not comment on. The Colt, whose name she didn't know yet, was not out of danger. Hannah knew that clearly. He would need warmth and feeding through the night. He would need watching. When she finally said so, she said it plainly. "He can't be moved tonight. If you take him back to the ranch in the open air, you'll undo everything." Caleb looked at her. Then he looked at the Colt breathing steadily now in the quilt on the braided rug. "I'll pay you for the trouble," he said. "Don't," she said. "Hannah, I said don't." She met his eyes evenly. "I didn't do it for payment. I did it because he was alive and you couldn't see it. That's not a service. That's just what a person does." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "What's your situation here?" he asked finally. Not rudely, not with pity, just straight. "I get by," she said. "The fence along your north line is down in 3 places." "I know. Your kitchen garden is going dry." "I know that too, Mr. Mercer." He turned his hat in his hands once. "I'll come back tomorrow." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "No." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm coming back tomorrow." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman given to impulse, and she was not a woman who accepted things from men without examining what the accepting would cost her. But there was nothing in his face she could fault. No calculation, no condescension, nothing that looked like charity dressed up as something else. "His name," she said. Caleb paused. "The Colt," she said. "He should have one." He looked at the small black animal breathing slowly on her rug. The firelight caught the Colt's coat black as river mud, with a faint warmth coming up through the fur, now a warmth that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Ember," Caleb said. Hannah nodded slowly. "Ember," she agreed. She walked him to the door. The sun was lower now. The heat slightly relented the dust on the creek road going gold and soft. Caleb stepped out, put his hat on, and turned back once. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Mercer." A pause. "Thank you," he said. And his voice when he said it was so quiet and so plain that it carried more weight than any speech she had ever been given. She watched him ride back down the creek road in the long summer evening light, his shoulders no longer carrying that particular hunch she'd noticed that morning. Then she went back inside and sat beside Ember and kept watch through the night. She did not sleep much, but Ember did. And sometime before dawn, the Colt rolled slightly and tucked his legs in, close the way sleeping foals do, warm and trusting, and already against all odds beginning to be at home. Ember was alive. That was the first thing Caleb thought when he woke before dawn the next morning, lying on his back in the big empty ranch house with the ceiling above him. The same ceiling. It had always been the same silence pressing down from every corner. Except something was different. Something in his chest had moved. Overnight shifted slightly off the position it had held for years, and it took him a full minute lying still to understand what it was. He had something to go back to. I was in the saddle before the sun fully cleared the ridge. Hannah heard his horse before she saw him. She was standing at the stove with a mashcloth in her hand, checking Ember's temperature for the third time that morning, when the familiar sound of hooves on the creek road made her go still. She had told herself she didn't expect him, but she had swept the cabin floor before dawn, and she had combed her hair. When she opened the door, Caleb Mercer was standing on the step with a flour sack in one arm and a folded blanket under the other. His hat was clean. He looked like a man who had also been awake for several hours. "How is he said. No good morning. No preamble. "Better," she said. "He took MASH twice in the night. Stood on his own about an hour ago, then sat back down. But he stood." The tension around Caleb's eyes released so visibly it almost looked like pain going away. "Can I see him?" She stepped back and let him in. He crouched beside Ember and laid his hand on the Colt's neck, the same way he had the morning before, flat, careful reading. Ember turned his head and pressed his nose briefly against Caleb's wrist. Caleb's throat moved. He set the flour sack down, without standing up like his legs had decided for him that he wasn't going anywhere yet. "I brought flour," he said, "and coffee, and a proper wool blanket that one's better for keeping the heat in." "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't." He looked up at her from where he was crouching. "I wanted to." Hannah held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the stove. He didn't go back that morning. He had intended to. He'd told himself on the ride over that he would check on Ember, leave the supplies, and get back to the ranch by midday. There were fence lines to check and water troughs to refill, and a dozen other tasks that didn't stop demanding attention because a man had other things on his mind. But when Hannah came out the back and found him standing at her north fence line, running his hand along the rotted post, she stopped and crossed her arms. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "You didn't." "I don't need charity, Mr. Mercer." "It's not charity." He gave the post a firm shake. It wobbled badly. "It's practical. Your fence falls down, your animals get out. You don't have animals yet, but you should, and when you do, when I do, I'll manage. You'll manage better with a fence that stands." He looked at her steadily. "I've got post wood in the wagon and nothing pressing until noon. Let me fix 3 of these and I'll leave the rest alone. You can pretend you didn't see it." Hannah stared at him. He waited. 4 posts, she said finally. "The corner one too. It's worse than the others." "Yes, ma'am." She went back inside without another word. But she brought him water 20 minutes later without being asked, and he drank it without making a fuss about it, and neither of them commented on any of it. They worked through the morning in a pattern that established itself without discussion. Caleb worked outside the fence, the loose board on the porch step, a rusted hinge on the barn door that shrieked every time the wind pushed it. Hannah worked inside the mash for Ember, the bread she'd been putting off the small repairs to the quilt she'd sacrificed the night before. When the heat reached its midday peak, she called him in for stew. It was thin, mostly garden carrots, and a small heel of salt pork she'd been stretching across the week, and she set it on the table without apology because she had decided long ago that she would not apologize for what she had. Caleb sat across from her and ate it like a man who hadn't tasted food made with any care in a long time, which Hannah suspected might be exactly true. They talked, not grandly, not about anything that mattered yet. He told her the Colt's mother had been his late wife's horse, a black mare named Sunday that Catherine had raised from a foal. When Sunday died in the foaling, something in Caleb had understood it as a kind of finality, the last thread of something he hadn't been able to name. Hannah listened without rushing him. "How long has she been gone?" she asked. "Your wife?" 4 years. "Mine's been 2, she said. He nodded. He didn't offer condolences. She appreciated that. The condolences of strangers had worn thin long before the second winter. "What was his name?" Caleb asked. "Thomas." She picked up her spoon. "He wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't built for this, for the dry years." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Neither was I," he said. "But I didn't get to leave." Hannah looked up at him. "Neither did I," she said. They looked at each other across the rough table, and something passed between them that wasn't yet anything nameable. Just the particular recognition of two people who have been carrying the same weight alone and suddenly understand they are standing in the same room. Caleb dropped his eyes first. He pushed his bowl slightly forward. "That's the best stew I've had in a considerable while," he said. Hannah allowed herself a small private smile. "It's mostly carrots. Best carrots in the county, then." She laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, the ease of it, how it came up without effort. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed out loud alone in this cabin. Caleb looked at her when she laughed, and he looked younger for a moment. Not young, but younger. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He never announced it. He simply appeared on the creek road in the early morning, and there was always something practical in his hands, and always something practical to do. He repaired the lean-to behind the cabin. He dug out the irrigation channel Hannah's garden desperately needed and ran it from the creek with a hand-cut log trough that would hold water through July if the rain held off, which it always did. Ember grew stronger with every visit. Within 5 days, the Colt was on his feet, reliably bumping against anyone who came near with the particular insistence of a young animal who has decided the world owes him attention. He followed Caleb around the small yard with a devotion that made Hannah press her lips together to hide her expression every time she saw it. "He thinks you're his mother," she told Caleb one morning, watching Ember headbutt Caleb's knee with stubborn affection. "Wouldn't be the first time I've been wrong assigned," Caleb said. He scratched the Colt behind the ears, and Ember leaned into it shamelessly. Hannah laughed again. It was becoming easier each time. They were sitting on the porch step in the early evening when the first sign came. The heat was finally letting go just slightly that particular hour, when the day admits it's finished, and everything goes copper and still. Hannah had brought out 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, the bag Caleb had brought, and they sat on the step with their shoulders not quite touching, watching Ember move around the small yard on legs that were increasingly confident and occasionally reckless. Down the creek road a wagon passed. It was the mercantile boy Jim Elster driving his father's delivery wagon back from the direction of the Braden place. He saw them. Hannah knew because the wagon slowed just slightly as it passed, not enough to stop, but enough. She watched Jim's face turn back toward the road. She kept her coffee cup steady. "He'll talk," she said, flat, without drama. Caleb looked toward the road. "He's a kid. His mother is Agnes Elster," Hannah said. "Agnes Elster talks to Ruth Connolly. Ruth Connolly talks to everyone." She took a sip of her coffee. "By Sunday, half this town will know you've been coming out here." A pause. "Let them know," Caleb said. "Easy for you to say," Hannah said quietly. "You're Caleb Mercer. You own the Mercer Ranch. You could take up with a circus woman and the town would eventually forgive you." She looked at her cup. "I'm a widow living alone on Public Creek Bank with a broken gate. They won't forgive me. They'll explain me." Caleb turned and looked at her directly. "Hannah, I'm not saying stop coming," she said quickly, because she was not a coward and she would not pretend. "I'm saying I know what this costs, for me, not for you." She looked at him. "I want you to know that I know." He was quiet for a long time. "I hear you," he said finally. She nodded. They finished their coffee. Ember came and stood directly in front of them and demanded attention until Caleb gave it, and the evening went on in its quiet way. But Hannah did not stop watching the road. She was right about Sunday. She knew it when she walked into Heller's Mercantile 4 days later, and the silence arrived before she did. Not the natural quiet of a store with few customers, the particular constructed silence of people who were speaking and stopped. Agnes Elster was at the dry goods counter with Ruth Connolly beside her. 2 other women, Hannah recognized from the church circle, stood near the yard goods. All 4 of them looked at her the way women look at a woman they have already decided something about. Hannah walked to the counter. "Morning," she said to Walt Heller behind the register. Plain, even, looking only at him. "Mrs. Whitaker." Walt's voice was careful. "Half pound of cornmeal, please, and a measure of salt." Walt moved to fill the order. Hannah kept her eyes front. She heard Ruth Connolly shift her weight. She heard Agnes Elster say something low to the woman beside her, not low enough. "Out there every morning, Jim says." A widow woman alone with a man like that. Bold as you please on the porch step. Hannah's hand on the counter was very still. She had learned this from years of hard seasons, that stillness is a form of power that a woman who does not flinch cannot easily be broken. Walt set her paper parcel on the counter. She paid him exact, picked up the parcel, and turned to go. Mrs. Whitaker. Agnes Elster's voice was light, friendly almost, the kind of friendly that cuts. Hannah turned. We were just saying, Agnes said with her hands folded and her chin slightly elevated, that it must be a comfort. Having a man around the property again. After everything. The after everything hung in the air like smoke. Hannah looked at Agnes Elster for a long, steady moment. It is, she said. Good morning. She walked out the door. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She walked to her wagon and climbed up and drove the creek road home and did not let her hands shake until she was past the last fence line of town. The second sign came 3 days later from a direction Hannah hadn't expected. She was in the yard giving Ember his midday check when a black carriage came down the creek road and turned through her gate without hesitation. It was a good carriage, an expensive one, the kind of carriage that expected people to move out of its way. The woman who stepped out of it was around 60, dressed in gray wool, despite the July heat, with silver hair pulled so tightly back it seemed to have declared war on softness. She looked at the cabin, looked at Ember, looked at Hannah, standing in the yard with a feed cloth in her hand, and arranged her face into something that was shaped like pleasantness, but was made of something entirely different. Mrs. Whitaker, the woman said. I'm Martha Ellison. Hannah knew who Martha Ellison was. Everyone in the county knew who Martha Ellison was. She had been the wealthiest woman in 3 townships before her husband died and had remained the most powerful one after. She had also been Catherine Mercer's mother. She was Caleb's former mother-in-law. Hannah set the feed cloth down slowly. Mrs. Ellison, she said. Martha moved toward her with the deliberate pace of a woman who had never in her life been made to hurry. She stopped at a socially correct distance and clasped her hands in front of her. I'll come directly to my purpose, Martha said. I understand you've been providing some assistance to my son-in-law, the matter of a Colt. That's correct, Hannah said, and I understand he has been reciprocating, coming out here regularly, doing repairs. Martha's eyes moved briefly over the fence line, the lean-to, the repaired porch step. A great deal of reciprocating. He's been kind, Hannah said. Her voice was level. He didn't have to be. No. Martha agreed with the smoothness of someone making a concession that costs nothing. He didn't. Caleb has always been generous. A pause. Sometimes to his own disadvantage. Hannah waited. Martha reached into the small bag she carried and produced an envelope. She held it out. Hannah looked at it and did not take it. What is that? Hannah said. $200, Martha said, quietly, as if the amount were a kindness rather than a calculation. Enough to start over somewhere more suitable. There are good towns to the south, calmer, less observed. The air between them was very still. Hannah looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Martha Ellison's face, which was patient and composed, and utterly certain, the way the faces of people look when they have never truly been refused. No, Hannah said. Martha's composure didn't crack. It just adjusted slightly the way very expensive china looks right before it breaks. Mrs. Whitaker, she said, I want you to consider carefully. Caleb Mercer is not— No, Hannah said again. Quieter this time, but not softer. Martha looked at her with something that had moved past pleasantness entirely. You don't understand what it is you're declining, Martha said. This town does not have a short memory. A woman in your position. What position is that? Hannah said. Martha's chin lifted half an inch. Poor, she said. Alone, without family, without standing, without anything to make you relevant here. Each word placed like a stone. Caleb Mercer is a man with history in this community. A name. Expectations attached to it. You would not be a benefit to him. You would be an embarrassment. And the town would make sure he understood that one way or another. A pause. Better for everyone if you understood it first. Hannah's heart was beating very hard. She kept that fact entirely inside herself. You rode all the way out here, Hannah said, in that heat in that wool dress to hand an envelope to a woman you've never met, because you're worried about what's best for Caleb. Martha said nothing. That's very devoted of you, Hannah said, for a woman whose devotion he doesn't appear to have requested. Something moved through Martha Ellison's eyes. Something with teeth. Take the money, Martha said. Very quiet now. The particular quiet of power that has run out of courtesy. No, Hannah said, for the third time. I think you should go. A long silence. Martha Ellison put the envelope back in her bag. She looked at Hannah for a moment with an expression Hannah had no desire to name. Then she turned and walked back to the black carriage, and the driver turned the horses, and the carriage went back down the creek road without hurrying. Hannah stood in the yard until it disappeared. Then she sat down on the porch step, right where she and Caleb had sat drinking coffee, and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Ember came and stood beside her, warm and solid and alive, and pressed his nose against her shoulder. I know, she said. She sat there for a long time. When Caleb came the next morning, she didn't tell him. She told herself it was because she didn't want him to feel responsible, and that was part of it, and true enough. But the other part, the part she sat with quietly in the evenings, was that she had already begun to understand what Martha Ellison's visit actually meant. It meant someone was watching, and someone who was watching would not stop there. The mercantile changed the following week. Walt Heller, who had always been correct if not warm, told her when she came in on Thursday that he was sorry, but he'd had to restrict credit to certain accounts. Said it with his eyes on the counter. Said it with an apology that was shaped correctly but had no spine inside it. Hannah had no account at the mercantile. She had always paid cash. She told Walt Heller that. Quietly. He told her more quietly still that he was sorry. She walked out with what she'd come for, and drove home, and sat at the table for a long time working through the arithmetic of what was beginning to happen. The cold inventory of a practical woman examining a situation without flinching. They were closing the doors, one at a time, slowly enough that each one could be called coincidence. Walt Heller and his restricted credit, Agnes Elster and her loaded silences, the women at the church who had stopped meeting her eyes after the service, the Braden boy who used to hire her for washing on Tuesdays, sending a note last week saying his wife would be handling the laundry herself now. She had known this could happen. She had told Caleb it could happen that evening on the step with their coffee cups. What she hadn't told him was how fast it would happen once someone decided to make it happen. Martha Ellison had not wasted time. Caleb came the next morning with lumber for a small gate repair, and found Hannah sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil working numbers. He set the lumber down outside and came in and looked at the paper. She let him look. How long has this been going on? He said. A week, she said, give or take. His jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have done exactly what you're about to do now, she said, which is look like you want to go into town and say something. I do want to go into town and say something. I know. She put the pencil down. And that won't fix it, Caleb. That will make it worse. If you ride in there and defend me publicly, it confirms everything they're already saying. That there's something between us that needs defending. There is something between us, he said, straight. No performance in it. Hannah looked at him. He held her gaze without blinking, and she understood that he meant it precisely as plainly as he'd said it, which was its own kind of thing to sit with. I know, she said. Then let me, not like that, she said. Not as my defender, not as the man coming to rescue the poor widow from the town gossips. That's not... She stopped, looked at her hands. That's not what I want from you, Caleb. That's not what I am. He was quiet for a long moment. What do you want? He said. She looked at him across the table, at the honest, weathered face of a man who had come here every morning for 3 weeks. Not because he owed her anything, but because something in him had started to remember what it was to want to be somewhere. I want, she said carefully, for this to be my choice, whatever happens. I want to choose it, not have it chosen for me by Martha Ellison, or Agnes Elster, or Walt Heller, or anyone else who's decided they know my worth better than I do." Caleb looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Martha came to see you." It wasn't a question. Hannah held very still. "What?" "She told me this morning," he said. "She came to the ranch, told me she'd gone to see you, told me she'd offered you money and you'd refused." He paused. "She made it sound like a warning." Hannah's breath went out slow and controlled. "What did you tell her?" Hannah said. Caleb's eyes were dark and completely steady. "I told her," he said, "that what you decide is your business, and what I decide is mine." A pause. "And that she had best stay off the creek road." The room was very quiet. Outside, Ember knocked against the fence post 3 times in a row, impatient and alive. Hannah looked down at her piece of paper with its numbers, and then she looked back at Caleb Mercer, and she thought about all the ways this could still go wrong, all the doors still left to close, all the people still willing to close them, and she understood with the clear and unsentimental clarity of a woman who had survived 2 hard winters alone that the road ahead was not going to get easier. But she also understood something else. She was not walking it alone anymore. She didn't say that. She simply picked up her pencil and looked at her numbers and said, "The lumber you brought, is it enough for the gate and the south post?" "And a little extra," Caleb said. "Good." She stood up. "Then let's not waste the morning." The gate held. That was the first thing Hannah noticed. 3 mornings after Caleb fixed it, the south gate swung clean and quiet on its new hinge, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the latch, just feeling the solid weight of something that worked the way it was supposed to work. Small things mattered out here. They always had. You learned that fast, or you didn't last. Ember was running the yard now. Not perfectly. He still stumbled on turns, still misjudged distances, with the particular overconfidence of a young animal who has survived something and decided that means he's invincible, but he was running. 3 weeks ago, he had been a still bundle in a flour sack on a dead man's errand. Now he was muscle and motion and noise, and every morning when Hannah came out and he lifted his head and came toward her, something in her chest did a thing she had stopped trying to name. Caleb came every morning. That was simply true now, the way the heat was true and the creek was true. He came early before the worst of the July sun, and he worked alongside her with the easy rhythm of someone who had stopped needing to explain himself. They had moved past explanation somewhere in the 2nd week without marking the moment. Now they just worked and talked and were quiet, and the quiet was the best part. The kind of quiet that only happens between people who have decided they are safe with each other. Hannah knew the town was watching every bit of it. She knew because she could feel the change in the air every time she drove in. The way conversations tilted when she walked into a room. The way women at the church steps found reasons to look elsewhere. She knew because Walt Heller had started being almost aggressively polite to her, the way people are when they are compensating for something they've done or are about to do. She knew because 3 different people had mentioned in 3 different casual ways that Martha Ellison had been seen at the Reverend's house for Sunday dinner 2 weeks running, which meant Martha was building something and using whatever foundation she could find. Hannah did not tell Caleb most of this. She told herself it was because she was handling it, and she was. But underneath that, in the place where honest things live, she knew she was also protecting something. The mornings, the gate, the quiet, the particular piece of a life that had started slowly and against considerable odds to feel like it belonged to her again. She didn't want that touched yet. She wasn't ready for it to be touched. The blacksmith refused her on a Wednesday. She had gone in for a simple thing, a hinge pin for the barn door, the old one having finally rusted through. Dale Purvis had been the only blacksmith in Harlan County for 20 years, and had never once turned away a paying customer. He was a practical man, not a social one. Hannah had always liked him for it. When she walked in, Dale looked up from his work, looked at her, and looked back down. "Can't help you today, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. Hannah stopped walking. "I'm sorry. Got a full order list." He didn't look up. Backed up 2 weeks. She looked around the shop. The anvil had nothing on it. The fire was banked low. The order board on the wall had 3 items on it, all with names she recognized, none of which were urgent. "Dale," she said. He kept his eyes on the metal he was working, which was cold. "I'm sorry," he said. And she believed that part. Actually, she could hear the sorry in it, the specific discomfort of a man doing something he knows is wrong and has decided to do anyway. "I can't help you right now." Hannah stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "All right," and walked back out into the July heat. She sat in her wagon outside the blacksmith shop for a moment longer than she needed to. Not falling apart, not crying, just calculating. Taking a clear inventory of what was happening and what it meant and what it was going to cost her. Martha Ellison had not ridden out to the creek road again. She didn't need to. She was doing something far more effective. She was simply closing things one at a time quietly, with the patient confidence of a woman who understood that a person can be erased from a community the same way water erases rock, not all at once, but slowly and completely, and with a great deal of time and pressure. Hannah drove home without the hinge pin. That evening she sat at the table and wrote out a careful list of everything she would need through August. Food supplies, repairs. She went through each one and marked which she could manage without the town, which she could substitute or delay, and which she genuinely could not get around. The list of things she couldn't get around was longer than she'd hoped and shorter than she'd feared. She was still working numbers when she heard Caleb's horse on the road, later than usual, the sun already low. She didn't get up. He knocked twice, and she called him in. He stood in the doorway, read her face, looked at the table, and came in and sat down across from her without taking his hat off. "What happened?" he said. "Purvis turned me away today," she said. Just like that. She was done not telling him things. Something moved through Caleb's face, fast, dark, controlled. His jaw set. "I'll go talk to Dale." "No." Her voice was firm. "Sit down, Caleb." He sat. "This is what she's doing," Hannah said. "Not with a big scene, not with anything you can push back against directly. She's making phone calls and church visits and friendly conversations. And one by one, the people in this town are choosing the side that costs them less." She folded her hands on the table. "If you go in and confront Dale Purvis, you embarrass him into a corner, and he becomes her ally instead of just her instrument. You make it worse." Caleb looked at her with the expression of a man who understands something intellectually and cannot stand it emotionally. "So we do nothing," he said. "I didn't say nothing," she said. "I said not that." A pause. "Then what?" he said. Hannah looked at her list, then at him. "I need to know something," she said. "And I need you to answer me straight." "Always," he said. "Is this—" She stopped. Started again. "What's between us? Is it something you're certain of, or is it something you're exploring?" She held his gaze. "Because the answer to that changes what comes next. And I'd rather know now, before the cost gets higher." The room was very quiet. Caleb took his hat off and set it on the table. "Hannah," he said, "I have not been certain of much in 4 years." His voice was even and direct. "But I am certain of this." She looked at him for a long time. "All right," she said. "Then here's what we do." They made a plan, the way people make plans, when they know they're going to need it, carefully, without illusions, talking through every piece of it across the table, while the evening light shifted and embers settled in the yard outside. It was not a dramatic plan. It was a practical one, which is the only kind that works. Hannah would continue buying what she needed from the surrounding townships, driving further if necessary. She would not ask the town for anything she could get elsewhere. She would give them nothing to use against her, no debt, no desperation, no visible distress. Caleb would not ride in on her behalf. Not yet. He would come to the creek road as he'd been coming because he had decided to, and because nothing Martha Ellison said was going to alter that, and because, and this he said plainly, he was done letting other people make his decisions for him out of social courtesy. "She's been doing it since Catherine died," he said. "Coming around, checking, making sure I was conducting my grief in the appropriate manner." His voice was quiet, not angry, something older than anger. "I let it go on because it seemed like the kind of thing I was supposed to let go on. Because she lost her daughter, and I had lost a wife, and we were both diminished, and it seemed unkind to fight about it. Hannah watched him. She's not grieving anymore, he said. She's managing. There's a difference. He looked at his hands. I should have seen it sooner. You saw it when you needed to, Hannah said. He looked up. That's generous, he said. No, she said. It's accurate. What neither of them planned for was what happened on the first Sunday of August. Hannah had not been going to church. She had made that decision quietly on her own 3 weeks before, not out of fear, but out of the practical recognition that sitting in a pew, surrounded by women who had made their judgments, was not worship. It was a performance of endurance, and she was not putting herself through it just to prove she could. But on the first Sunday of August, she changed her mind. She changed it because she had been in the cabin 4 straight days, due to a summer fever that had passed, but left her slow and gray, and because she had lain in the heat of those 4 days, thinking about what Martha Ellison had said to her in the yard, that she was poor alone, without standing, without anything to make her relevant, and she had decided very quietly that she was done letting those words have the weight they'd been carrying. She put on her best dress, which wasn't much, and she drove into town. She sat in the third pew from the back on the left side alone. She kept her eyes forward and her hands folded in her lap, and she sang when the congregation sang, and she bowed her head when they prayed, and she felt the room's awareness of her like heat from a second stove pressing in from all sides. Martha Ellison was in the front row. She did not turn around, but Hannah saw her shoulders go slightly rigid when Hannah took her seat, a movement so subtle that only someone watching for it would have caught it. Reverend Aldous preached on the subject of charity. Hannah was not sure whether this was ironic or merely coincidental. She decided it didn't matter and listened anyway. After the service in the yard outside the congregation formed its usual clusters, and Hannah walked through them toward her wagon with her chin level and her pace steady. She was 3 feet from the wagon when Agnes Elster stepped into her path, not accidentally. Mrs. Whitaker, Agnes said. Bright voice, hard eyes. We haven't seen you in some weeks. I've been occupied, Hannah said. Yes. Agnes smiled. The women around her, Ruth Connolly, a woman named Vera Drake, who Hannah barely knew, and one other whose name she'd forgotten, arranged themselves in that particular loose semicircle that isn't quite a wall, but functions as one. We've heard you've been quite occupied, out at the creek. I have, Hannah said. Calm. Flat. Alone, Agnes added. The word landed with its full intended weight. Not entirely, Hannah said. As you've noted, Agnes's smile didn't waver. You know, Mrs. Whitaker, we all think it's very admirable, the way you've been managing, since Thomas passed. A pause shaped like a knife. A woman in your circumstances finding friendship wherever she can. The word friendship was a slap wearing a glove. Hannah looked at Agnes Elster directly. Mrs. Elster, she said, I've been on this land for 7 years. I buried a husband, kept a farm, and kept my word to every person in this town who deserved it. I don't require your admiration, and I'm not asking for your approval. She kept her voice even. But I'd appreciate it if you said plainly what you mean to say, rather than wearing it like a Sunday hat. A short electric silence. Agnes's smile went stiff. Ruth Connolly made a small sound. Hannah turned and walked to her wagon and climbed up and drove home. She didn't shake this time. She was angry, which was different. Clean and clarifying, not like fear, not like shame. Just anger, and underneath it something that felt almost like relief, because she had said what was true, and she had said it in front of witnesses, and it could not be taken back. The real blow came 4 days later. She had gone to Heller's Mercantile for salt and thread, 2 things she could not substitute or delay, and Walt Heller had met her at the door. Not inside. At the door. With his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor, and an expression so miserable that Hannah almost felt sorry for him. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, I'm afraid I can't serve you today. Hannah went completely still. I'm sorry, Walt said. I truly am. I received a communication. From certain... He stopped. My wife, he said. And others. They've made it clear that if I continue to... He couldn't finish. If you continue to serve me, Hannah said. Walt looked at the floor. They'll take their accounts elsewhere, Hannah said, and several have already spoken to the Braden family about establishing a competing store. Walt said so quietly she almost missed it. I can't afford... He stopped. I'm sorry, Hannah. She had not given him permission to use her first name. She noticed it and said nothing. She turned and walked back to her wagon. She did not go home directly. She sat on the wagon seat on the main street of town and looked at the buildings around her. The church steeple, the mercantile, the blacksmith, the post office, the row of storefronts she had known for 7 years, and she understood with a clarity that cut clean through everything exactly what Martha Ellison had accomplished. She had not raised her voice. She had not broken any law. She had simply applied pressure steadily and precisely to every point where Hannah depended on the town. And she had done it so quietly, so politely, so thoroughly, that there wasn't a single person Hannah could point to and call it cruelty. They were all just making choices about their own businesses, their own families. Hannah drove home. She fed Ember. She filled the water trough. She went inside and sat at the table and did not cry and did not panic and did not do anything dramatic, because dramatic wouldn't help, and she had always known that. But for the first time since Thomas died, she was genuinely afraid. Not of being poor. She knew how to be poor. Not of being alone. She knew how to be that too. She was afraid of disappearing. Of being erased from a community she had given 7 years of her life to, quietly and completely, by a woman who had decided she was not convenient. And she was afraid that if she stayed, if she held on here through the pressure and the silence and the closed doors, she would eventually cost Caleb something he couldn't get back. That fear was the loudest one. She sat with it through the afternoon. When Caleb came the next morning, he knew immediately. He walked in, looked at her face, and put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward. Tell me, he said. She told him all of it. Heller, Agnes Elster in the churchyard, all the pieces she'd been carrying and distributing carefully, so he only got some of them. She laid them all out one after another and watched his face go through things she didn't entirely have names for. When she finished, he was very quiet. How long have you been carrying this? He said. Most of it, she said, since it started. Hannah. I know, she said. I know I should have told you sooner. I was trying to... She stopped. I didn't want you to feel like you had to fix it. Like I was a problem you'd accidentally acquired along with a Colt. He straightened up, looked at her with something in his eyes that was not gentleness exactly, but was something that included it. You are not a problem, he said. You are the only thing that has made sense to me in 4 years. A pause. I should have said that sooner too. Hannah held his gaze. Outside, Ember knocked at the fence post twice. The cicadas ran their endless noise across the heat. She had made her decision actually sometime in the night, though she hadn't named it until this moment. She had lain in the dark and run the numbers. Not the money numbers, but the other ones. The ones about dignity and worth, and what she was willing to trade for what, and she had understood that she was not willing to leave. Not because of Caleb, though Caleb was part of it, but because she had not done anything wrong. She had saved a life. She had kept her word. She had worked her land and minded her conduct and refused to be bought. And she was not going to let Martha Ellison's patient, expensive, well-organized cruelty rewrite that into something shameful. But she also understood that the decision had moved past what she could manage quietly. I'm not leaving, she told Caleb. Good, he said. But something has to change, she said. The way it's been coming out here every morning fixing things, not saying anything about what it is that's been working for me. It's been working for us. But it's also given them all the material they need to build whatever story they want. She looked at him straight. I think it's time to stop letting them write the story. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. What does that look like? He said. She was quiet for a second. Then, I don't know yet, but I know it has to happen in town, in front of people. Not out here where they can dismiss it. He nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do, he said. She left that night. She had not planned it, Or perhaps she had planned it and not admitted it to herself, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. She lay awake in the heat after Caleb had gone, and she thought about every morning he'd come down the creek road and every door that had closed, and every woman who had looked through her in the churchyard, and every piece of Martha Ellison's quiet, relentless architecture. And she thought about what she had told Caleb. "I'm not leaving," and she believed it. She still believed it. But she also thought about the thing she hadn't said. The thing she had kept in the very bottom of all her calculations, because looking at it directly required more steadiness than she'd had until now. If she stayed and the town's campaign continued, it would eventually reach Caleb's business. Not just his social standing, his contracts, his suppliers, the men who bought cattle from the Mercer Ranch, and the banks that carried his notes. Martha Ellison had money and patience and history and connection. She would use all of it. And she would keep using it until either Hannah was gone or Caleb was damaged enough that the relationship cost more than it gave. Hannah knew how these things worked. She had watched Thomas make a similar calculation once years before his death about a friend he'd backed in a business dispute that the whole town opposed. Thomas had stood by his friend for 3 months and then quietly, gradually retreated. He had never said why not in those words. But Hannah had understood. She was not going to be the reason Caleb Mercer retreated from his own life. She got up before dawn. She packed a bundle, not much, just what she needed, and a few things she couldn't leave. She left the good quilt because it was her mother's, and she would come back for it. She left the coffee tin Caleb had brought because that felt like leaving a message without using words. She stood at the door and looked at Ember asleep in the yard. She almost went back inside. Instead, she walked to him and put her hand on his neck for a long moment. He was warm. His breathing was deep and steady. 3 weeks ago, he had been a body in the sand. Now he was a life that was going to go on and grow strong and run the Mercer pastures someday, and that had happened because she had refused to look away. "Take care of him," she said quietly. She walked to the road. She did not look back because she was the kind of woman who made decisions and carried them, and looking back would not change what she'd decided and would only make the carrying harder. She walked through the dark of the early morning with her bundle and the particular steady grief of a person doing something right that feels completely wrong, and she thought about what she'd said to Ember 3 weeks ago at the stove when no one was listening. "You had a hard beginning. That doesn't mean you get a short story." She held on to that. She had leave, it was still true. Caleb arrived at the creek cabin just after sunrise. The gate was unlatched. The door was unlatched. Ember was in the yard, but the cabin was quiet in the specific way that buildings are quiet when they have recently lost the presence of a person. He stood in the doorway. The coffee tin was on the table. The quilt was folded on the chair. The pencil and the list she'd been working on was gone. He stood there for a long time. Then he looked at Ember, who was watching him with the focused attention of an animal who has noticed that something important is missing and is waiting for a human to explain it. Caleb put his hand on the Colt's neck. His jaw worked. I thought about everything she had said about not wanting to be rescued, not wanting to be the poor widow, being defended, wanting to choose. He thought about the careful way she'd laid it all out for him across that rough table, honest and steady, and completely without self-pity. He thought about what she'd said about the story. "I think it's time to stop letting them write it." He thought about what it meant that she had left before they could do that together. I understood with a clarity that arrived slowly, and then all at once, that Hannah Whitaker had done the thing she always did. She had looked at the situation without flinching, calculated what it was costing, and protected someone else at her own expense. She had been doing it the whole time. With the Colt. With him. With all of it. She had saved things by not letting them go, and now she was trying to save him by leaving. He stood in that empty yard with the coffee tin and the quilt, and the Colt that was alive because she had refused to be told something true could not be done. And he thought no. Not this time. He put his hat on. He got on his horse. He rode toward town. He rode hard, not reckless. Caleb Mercer had never been a reckless man, but with the particular urgency of someone who has finally run out of patience for doing things the slow, careful, socially acceptable way. The sorrel knew the difference. She picked up the pace without being asked. He had one stop to make before town. He turned off the main road at the Braden fence line and rode the half-mile to the small house where he knew from 7 years of county knowledge that Hannah's closest neighbor, old Sadie Pruitt, took in travelers and kept a spare room. It was the most likely place. It was also, he realized as he rode, the kind of calculation that only a woman like Hannah would make at 2 in the morning, in the dark, practical quiet, costing no one anything. Sadie answered his knock before he'd finished knocking. She was 70, small, sharp-eyed, and entirely unsurprised to see him. "She's here," Sadie said. "She told me you'd come." Something in Caleb's chest released so fast it almost hurt. "Can I?" "She said to tell you she doesn't want to be talked out of anything," Sadie said. She was very clear about that. "I'm not coming to talk her out of anything," he said. "I'm coming to tell her something." Sadie looked at him for a long moment, with the evaluating eye of a woman who has seen a great deal of men at their worst and knows how to tell the difference. "Wait there," she said. She closed the door. He waited. The sun was fully out, the heat building in its slow, merciless way. He held his hat in his hands and stood on the step and did not pace, because pacing was the thing men did when they were not certain, and he was certain. The door opened again. Hannah stood in it. She was dressed. She hadn't slept. He could see that immediately, the shadows under her eyes, the set of her jaw that came from a night of decision-making rather than rest. She had her bundle at her feet. She looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who has already thought through every version of this conversation and arrived at the same conclusion in all of them. "Caleb," she said, quietly. "I know what you did," he said. "I know why." "Then you know I was right," she said. "You were right about one thing," he said, "and wrong about something bigger." She crossed her arms. "Say it then." "You decided for me," he said. "Again. The same way you decided not to tell me about Purvis and about Agnes Elster in the churchyard, and about how many doors had closed. You made my calculation for me because you thought you knew what it would cost me better than I did." He held her gaze. "You keep doing that, Hannah. You keep deciding what I can handle." Her expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "That's not," she started. "It is," he said. "And I understand why. I'm not angry about it. But I need you to hear me now, and I need you to let it land without immediately deciding I'm wrong." She was quiet. He took a breath. "I spent 4 years," he said, "letting people decide things for me. Letting Martha decide when my grief was appropriate. Letting the ranch hands decide what the place needed. Letting everybody in that town decide when I was ready and what I was ready for, and whether I was conducting myself in a manner that fit their picture of a widower." He stopped. "And then a woman on a creek bank told me a colt wasn't dead, just cold. And she was right about the colt. She was right about more than the colt." His voice was steady. "I am not going to let anyone decide this for me. Not Martha, not the town, and not you." Hannah looked at him for a long time. The morning pressed in around them. Heat cicadas, the distant sound of Sadie moving around inside the house. "I was trying to protect you," Hannah said. "I know," he said. "I don't need protecting. I need you to trust that I know the cost and I'm choosing it anyway." A pause. Her jaw worked slightly. "It's a high cost," she said. "Everything worth having is." She looked at her feet, then back at him. "Caleb," she said, "if I go back out there and we keep on the way we've been, Martha Ellison is not going to stop. She has more patience than either of us. She has more resources. She'll keep closing doors until—" "I know," he said. "That's why we're not going back out there." She blinked. "What?" "Not the way we've been," he said. "You told me last night it was time to stop letting them write the story." He put his hat back on. "I agree. So we're going to go into town, and we're going to write it ourselves." Hannah stared at him. "Right now," she said. "Right now," he said. "Before I lose my nerve." A pause. "I won't lose my nerve. But I'd rather not wait." Something moved through Hannah's face, that she didn't entirely control, something quick and complicated, and not quite a smile, but in the same family as one. "Sadie," she called over her shoulder. "I heard," Sadie called back from somewhere inside. Go on, leave the bundle. I'll keep it. They rode into town side by side, which was itself a statement, though neither of them framed it as one. Caleb on the sorrel, Hannah on the wagon she'd borrowed from Sadie without asking, because Sadie had pressed the reins into her hands without being asked. That was the kind of woman Sadie Pruitt was. It was mid-morning. The main street was alive with the ordinary business of a Thursday wagon's foot traffic, the mercantile doing a steady trade, women with baskets, men in working clothes. The kind of ordinary day that does not expect to be interrupted. Caleb stopped in front of Heller's mercantile. He dismounted and tied the sorrel. He looked at Hannah, who had pulled the wagon up alongside him, and sat with the reins in her hands, watching him with an expression that was mostly calm and a little afraid, which was honest, which was what he expected from her. "You don't have to be part of this part," he said, "if you want to wait." "If I wanted to wait," she said, "I would have stayed at Sadie's." She climbed down from the wagon. They walked into the mercantile together. Walt Heller looked up from behind the counter, looked at Caleb, looked at Hannah, looked back at Caleb with an expression that traveled rapidly through surprise, discomfort, and a particular kind of dread that people feel when they understand that a reckoning has arrived, and they have been standing on the wrong side of it. There were 4 other people in the store. Agnes Elster's sister, a man named Crawford, who ranched east of town, and 2 women Hannah didn't know well. They all looked up. Caleb walked to the counter. "Walt," he said, "Mrs. Whitaker needs salt and thread. She'll be paying cash same as always." He said it the way he said most things, quietly, plainly, with no particular performance attached. "And going forward, her account, when she chooses to open one, will be backed by the Mercer name. You understand me?" Walt's face was the color of old flour. "Caleb," he said, "there were certain—" "I'm not asking about the certain anythings," Caleb said. "I'm telling you what's going to be true from this point on. Mrs. Whitaker's credit is my credit. Her standing here is my standing." He paused. "Does that answer the concern?" A silence so complete you could hear the flies on the window glass. Walt cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. "Yes, sir, of course." Agnes Elster's sister had her hand over her mouth. Hannah, standing 2 steps back from Caleb's shoulder, kept her face entirely still. Inside her heart was going so hard, she was mildly surprised no one could hear it. Walt went and got the salt and the thread without another word. He wrapped them properly. He set them on the counter and named a price that was correct and fair. Hannah paid him exact. She did not say thank you, because she had earned that transaction, and gratitude for what you've earned is a kind of concession. She picked up the parcel and walked out. It was in the street that it happened. They were 3 steps from the mercantile door when Martha Ellison's carriage came around the corner from the direction of the church. It was the same black carriage, the same expensive conveyance, and it would have passed without stopping, except that Martha Ellison's driver slowed without being asked, because Martha Ellison had seen them, and her driver knew what that meant. The carriage stopped. Martha descended with the same deliberate, unhurried dignity she always carried. She was in gray again. She looked at Caleb first, then Hannah, then at the parcel in Hannah's hand, and her face arranged itself into the specific expression of a woman who has invested considerably in an outcome and is watching it dissolve. The street was not empty. It was never empty at mid-morning. People were watching, some openly, some from the corners of their eyes, but watching. This was the kind of moment that towns fed on for years afterward. Martha walked toward them. "Caleb," she said, as if Hannah weren't there, as if she could restructure reality by simply declining to acknowledge the parts of it she didn't prefer. "Martha," he said. "I'd like a word," she said, controlled, precise, privately. "Whatever you want to say to me," he said, "you can say in front of Hannah." A pause. Martha's chin lifted. "Caleb." Her voice dropped into that particular register, low, personal, invoking history and grief and connection. "I am asking you to think about what you're doing, about what Catherine would have—" "Don't." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her mid-sentence. "Don't use her. Don't bring Catherine into this." His jaw was set. "Catherine has been gone 4 years. She cannot want anything anymore, and she would not thank you for putting words in her mouth to win an argument. Martha's composure fractured just for a second, just a crack across the surface, and underneath it, Hannah saw something she hadn't expected. Not calculation, not power, something that looked briefly like genuine grief. But grief, Hannah had learned, can still cause damage, sometimes more than cruelty. "She was my daughter," Martha said. Rawer now, the smoothness gone. "I know," Caleb said, and his voice was not unkind. "I know that, and I'm sorry for what you lost. I will always be sorry for it." He paused. "But you don't get to take the rest of my life as payment for your grief. That's not how this works." Martha's eyes moved to Hannah. Hannah met them. "You turned down my envelope," Martha said. "Yes," Hannah said. "You understand what it is you're choosing," Martha said. "The difficulty of it." "I've been choosing difficult things my whole life," Hannah said. "I'm not afraid of that part." Martha looked at her for a long, searching moment. Not with the social pleasantness she'd worn on the creek road. Something more direct, as if she were for the first time actually looking. "What is it you want?" Martha asked. And the question, stripped of everything performative, was almost honest. "What I've always wanted," Hannah said. "To be seen as what I am, not as what's convenient for someone else's story." She paused. "I'm not your daughter's replacement. I'm not a scandal. I'm not a charity case. I'm a woman who worked hard land and kept her word and saved a life when you all were ready to let it go." She held Martha's gaze. "That ought to count for something." The street was very quiet. Martha Ellison stood in the July heat with her hands clasped and her gray dress and her black carriage behind her, and she looked at Hannah Whitaker with an expression that Hannah could not fully read and did not try to. Then she looked at Caleb. Something passed across her face, old and complicated and too private to interpret from the outside. She put her hand briefly on Caleb's arm, not grabbing, not claiming. Just touching. The way people touch something they are letting go of. "You look better," she said quietly, "than you have in years." She dropped her hand. She turned. She walked back to her carriage, and her driver helped her in, and the carriage moved back down the street without hurrying, and the sound of the wheels on the dirt road faded and then was gone. Caleb stood very still for a moment. Hannah stood beside him and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing. The street around them slowly resumed its noise and movement, the way water resumes flowing after an obstruction is cleared. Crawford, the rancher from east of town, appeared at Caleb's shoulder. "Caleb," he said, gruff and plain, "your credit's good with me." He stuck out his hand. Caleb shook it. Two other men nodded from across the street. Small gestures. Enough. Agnes Elster's sister had disappeared, which Hannah took to mean that she had gone to report what had happened to Agnes, which meant it would be through every household in the county by nightfall. This time Hannah did not mind that. This time, let them talk. The story they had to tell now was a different one. She came back to herself slowly, the way you do after something large has passed through. Caleb was beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, which was one of the things about him she had quietly valued from very early on. "Well," she said finally. "Well," he agreed. She looked down at the parcel in her hands. Salt and thread. The most ordinary things in the world. "That went," she started. "About as well as it could," he said. "Martha," Hannah said. She paused, sorting through what she'd seen in those last moments. "She's not a villain exactly." "No," Caleb said. "She's a woman who loves things fiercely and has never learned that you can't keep them by gripping harder." Hannah looked at him. "That's a generous read," she said. "Maybe." He looked down the road in the direction the carriage had gone. "She lost Catherine. Then she decided I was what she had left. I understand the logic even if I can't live inside it." A pause. "I should have made that clear to her 2 years ago. I kept avoiding it because grief is—" He stopped. "It's complicated to argue with grief." "Yes," Hannah said. "It is." They stood together in the street in the July heat, and the noise of an ordinary Thursday morning that had been for a few minutes something else entirely. "I need to ask you something," Caleb said. "All right, I have a ranch house," he said. "It's too big. It's been too quiet for 4 years. The kitchen hasn't smelled like food in longer than I want to admit. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm not asking you to be Catherine, or to fill a space she left. I'm asking you to come and make something new. He paused. With me. On equal terms. As a partner. Not as charity, and not as rescue. Hannah looked at him. The sun was high and hot. The street was busy and loud and entirely ordinary around them. She thought about the cabin at the creek, the broken gate he'd fixed the lean-to, the irrigation channel, the braided rug, the coffee tin she'd left on the table as a message without words. She thought about Ember running the yard on legs that had no business being as strong as they were. She thought about all the numbers she'd run at that rough table, the lists of what she needed, and what she could manage, and what she couldn't substitute. She thought about what she'd said to a newborn Colt in the dark the first night when she didn't know if he was going to make it, and she kept talking to him anyway. You had a hard beginning. That doesn't mean you get a short story. Equal terms, she said. Equal terms, he confirmed. You bring what you have. I bring what I have. We figure out the rest together. That's not a very romantic offer, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She held his gaze. It's better than romantic, she said. She took his hand. Not dramatically. Not with any particular ceremony. Just reached over and put her hand in his, the way you take hold of something solid, when the ground has been uncertain, and you've found finally a place that holds. He closed his hand around hers. They walked to the horses together. The ranch house was quiet when they arrived. Not the dead quiet it had been even before Hannah crossed the threshold. She could hear the difference, or thought she could, though perhaps that was imagination working in the service of something true. Caleb pushed the front door open and stepped back to let her in first, not with ceremony, but with the particular courtesy of a man who understands whose crossing this is. She stood in the entryway. It was a good house. Solid-built, wide-roomed with windows that would catch the cross breeze if someone opened them, which clearly no one had done in some time. Everything was clean, but still the stillness of a place that had been maintained without being inhabited. There was a difference between those two things, and this house knew it. Hannah walked to the nearest window and opened it. Then she crossed the room and opened another. The air moved. The curtains shifted. Dust lifted and rearranged itself and settled somewhere new. Caleb stood and watched her. The kitchen, she said. Not a question. Through there, he said. She went through and he followed. The kitchen was larger than her whole cabin. It had a proper stove, a good work table, a shelf of decent pots, and a window over the basin that looked out toward the north pasture. Hannah stood in the center of it and put both hands on the work table and felt the solid weight of it under her palms. I'll need my herbs, she said. I have them drying at the cabin, and my mother's quilt. We'll go get them tomorrow, he said. And Ember needs to come here, she said. He's too far from proper care where he is. Already planned it, he said. She looked up at him. You planned Ember's move before you came to Sadie's this morning. I planned it on the ride over, he said. I had time. Hannah shook her head slowly. Not in frustration. In the reluctant recognition of a woman who has been outmaneuvered by a man who is quieter and faster than he looks. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. She turned back to the window. The north pasture lay open and dry and long, the grass gone gold in the August heat, shimmering slightly in the late afternoon light. That pasture needs work, she said. It does, he said. The creek irrigation your hands dug last spring is running shallow. I noticed on the way in. I know. The east fence line was... Hannah. His voice was quiet. She stopped. We've got time, he said. We don't have to fix everything today. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. She stopped. I've been running numbers for so long. Looking at what needs doing. It's a hard habit to put down. You don't have to put it down, he said. Just don't do it alone anymore. She looked at him over her shoulder. Something in her face went softer than she'd let it go in a long time. That'll take some getting used to, she said. I imagine it will, he said. For both of us. She nodded. She turned back to the window. Outside, the pasture stretched long and golden under the August sky. Empty now, but not forever empty. She could see it suddenly, the way you see a thing before it exists. Ember running those long lines of grass, someday black and strong, racing just because he could. She pressed her hand flat against the window frame. Behind her, she heard Caleb move to the stove and open the grate. "I'll get the fire started," he said. "If you want to look through what's in the kitchen." "I'll make something," she said. "If there's anything worth working with." "There might be," he said. "I brought supplies yesterday. Was hoping." She turned. "You brought supplies yesterday." He was crouching at the stove, adding kindling. He looked up at her with an expression that was careful and slightly undefended. "I was hoping," he said again. Hannah Whitaker stood in the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch house on an August afternoon with the windows open and the air finally moving, and she looked at this man, this weathered, quiet, hoping man, who had come to a creek bank to bury something and had, despite himself, come away with more than he'd arrived with. She reached for the nearest pot. "What do you have?" she said. He told her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. The first morning. Hannah woke up in the Mercer Ranch house. She lay still for a full minute before she understood where she was. Not the cabin. Not the narrow, familiar walls. Not the sound of the creek through the gap under the door. The ceiling was higher. The light came in from a different angle. The sounds were different. The particular creak of a larger house settling into the heat. The wind moving through the north pasture. The distant noise of the ranch hands starting their day in the barn. She lay there and took inventory the way she always did, the habit of years. What needs doing? What can wait? What cannot be substituted? The list was different now, longer in some ways, better in others. She got up before the sun was fully clear of the ridge, because that was who she was, and a new house was not going to change it. She built the kitchen fire, found the coffee, and had it ready by the time she heard Caleb's boots on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, took in the scene. The fire. The coffee. Hannah at the work table with her sleeves already rolled, and something in his face went quietly and completely settled. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She poured. They drank their coffee in the early quiet of the kitchen with the window open and the morning coming in. And it was so ordinary and so good that neither of them said a word about it, because some things don't need saying to be true. Ember arrived 2 days later. Caleb brought him in from Sadie's with the same care he'd carried him in the flour sack, which was to say, complete and undemonstrative, and turned him into the north pasture with the gate latched behind him. Hannah stood at the fence and watched. Ember stood in the center of the pasture for a moment, very still, ears forward, taking in the size of a space that was larger than anything he'd known. Then he shook his head once hard and ran, not carefully, not tentatively. He ran the way young animals run when they understand suddenly that the world has more room in it than they knew full out. Legs finding their stride, black coat catching the morning light, circling wide and then coming back to stand at the fence in front of Hannah, blowing hard through his nose, clearly pleased with himself. Hannah laughed. Behind her, Caleb said, "Show off." "He earned it," she said. She heard Caleb come stand beside her at the fence. They watched Ember shake himself and begin to graze unhurried now, as if the running had settled something and he was ready to be calm. "He's going to be something," Caleb said. "He already is," Hannah said. The ranch hands were another thing she hadn't planned for. There were 3 of them. Pete, a wide-shouldered older man who had worked the Mercer place for 11 years. Denny, who was young and talked too much and meant no harm by any of it. And a quiet Mexican hand named Reyes, who had been with Caleb the longest and said perhaps 12 words total in Hannah's first week there. Pete had been the one she'd worried about. He was the kind of man who had opinions about how things should be formed over years of routine, and she had expected him to be stiff with her at best and cold at worst. He surprised her. The 3rd morning she brought coffee out to the barn where they were working and set it on the bench without making an occasion of it. Pete looked at it, looked at her and said, "Much obliged, ma'am." with the plain gruff sincerity of a man who has been without a properly run kitchen for 4 years and understands exactly what he's been missing. After that, they were fine. Denny immediately began telling her everything about the ranch that she hadn't asked about yet: the water schedule, the fence rotation, the particular history of every horse currently in the barn, with the earnest generosity of a young man delighted to have a new audience. She let him talk and absorb the information without telling him she was doing it. Reyes, on the 5th day, stopped near her kitchen garden, the one she'd started at the south end of the house, moving her herbs and adding what the ranch's soil could offer, and crouched beside the row of struggling tomato plants. He pressed 2 fingers into the soil, pulled them out, looked at them. "Too dry here," he said. It was one of his 12 words. "I know," she said. "I haven't run the line yet." He nodded. The next morning when she came out, there was a small hand-cut irrigation line running from the pump to her garden, laid with care and without comment. She found Reyes at breakfast and said, "Thank you." He said, "Yes, ma'am," and went back to eating. Hannah understood that she had been accepted. The letters started arriving in the 3rd week, not to her, to Caleb. From men. He did business with men who had heard things, men who were writing to reassure themselves that the Mercer Ranch was still operating as expected and that the stories coming out of town were exaggerated. Caleb read each one at the kitchen table in the evenings and handled them the same way. Brief, plain replies that said the ranch was in good order, and what happened in his personal life was his own matter, and he trusted the correspondent felt the same about their own. Hannah watched this process from across the table, where she was usually mending something or working through the supply lists she'd begun keeping for the ranch kitchen. And she held her silence because she had promised herself she would not make herself small on his behalf, and also would not manufacture drama where there was none. One evening, he set a letter down and looked at her directly. "Harmon Speck," he said. "Cattle buyer from Tulsa. Good business for the past 6 years. He's suggesting he might redirect to the Finley operation this season." Hannah kept her eyes on her mending. "What are you going to do?" "Write back and tell him that's his prerogative," Caleb said. "And that the Mercer cattle are what they've always been, and any man who lets gossip run his business decisions is probably not the steadiest partner anyway." She looked up. "That'll cost you," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe Harmon Speck reads a plain letter from a man who isn't apologizing for his life and decides he'd rather do business with someone who knows what he's about." He picked up his pen. "Either way, I'm not writing an apology." Hannah went back to her mending. "No," she said. "Don't." The twist nobody saw coming arrived on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Hannah had moved into the ranch house, and it came from the last direction she would have expected. She was in the kitchen when she heard a carriage on the road. She recognized the sound before she saw it, because she had heard that particular carriage twice before, and its sound had a very specific quality: expensive, deliberate, expecting. Martha Ellison's black carriage came down the ranch road and stopped at the front of the house. Hannah set down what she was holding. She heard Caleb come through from the back, heard him stop when he saw the carriage through the window. Heard the quality of his stillness, not afraid, not ready to fight, waiting. "I'll go," he said. "We'll go," Hannah said. He looked at her. "We'll go," she said again. Even. Clear. They walked out together. Martha descended from the carriage the same way she always did. Unhurried, dignified, wearing that impenetrable quality of self-possession that Hannah had spent a great deal of time being frustrated by. Today, though, something was different. Not in how she moved, in what she was carrying. She was carrying nothing. No envelope, no bag, no armor of objects, just herself. Which was, Hannah realized, actually more than she'd brought either time before. She stopped a few feet from them. She looked at Caleb first, then at Hannah. Her eyes up close looked tired. Not defeated, but tired in the specific way that people look when they have spent considerable energy on something and are taking honest stock of what it accomplished. "I owe you both an accounting," she said. No greeting, no pleasantness shaped like pleasantness. Just that. Neither Caleb nor Hannah said anything. Martha looked at Hannah directly. "I treated you as a problem to be solved," she said. Not as a person. I knew almost nothing about you, and I chose to know nothing, because knowing would have complicated what I'd already decided. She paused. That was wrong. It was wrong in a way. I'd like to think I'm usually too sensible for, and I was not sensible, and I'm not in the habit of pretending otherwise when I've made a plain error. Hannah's heart was going hard, but her face was still. What changed, she said, because she needed to understand it. She was not a woman who accepted things without understanding them. Martha's expression shifted slightly. Reverend Aldous, she said. He came to see me 2 weeks ago. A pause. He told me that Mrs. Whitaker had sat in his congregation every Sunday for 7 years and given what she had when she didn't have much, and that she had conducted herself with more dignity than most people twice her means, and that what I was doing to her business in this town was something he could not stay quiet about. She stopped. He is not a man who speaks bluntly. When he spoke bluntly, I listened. A beat of silence. And, Martha added quieter, as if this part cost more. I asked about you. Properly. Asked people who knew you before Caleb. Before any of this. She looked at Hannah steadily. You sat with the Garn woman when her husband was dying. You brought food to the Braden family during the fever year. You didn't tell anyone. You just did it. A pause. I didn't know that. I should have known it before I made any decisions. I didn't look. The air between them was very still. Hannah did not offer forgiveness immediately because she was not an impulsive woman, and forgiveness that arrives too quickly is not forgiveness, it's performance. She held what Martha had said and let it sit for a moment. You did real damage, Hannah said, finally. Not just to me. To people like Walt Heller who didn't want to choose but felt they had to. To Dale Purvis, who is probably still uncomfortable every time he sees me. You used the town as a mechanism, and some of those mechanisms hurt people who didn't have much protection. Martha held her gaze. She did not flinch, which Hannah credited. I know, Martha said. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, Hannah said, because it wasn't. But I'm also not going to carry it forever, because that would be doing to myself what you were trying to do, making my life smaller than it ought to be. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Caleb. She's formidable, she said. I know it, Caleb said. Something moved through Martha's face. Not quite a smile. Something with more weight than a smile recognition, maybe. The recognition of a woman seeing clearly for the first time something she had been looking at sideways. I want to do right by this, Martha said. I don't know yet entirely how, but I'm asking for the opportunity to try. Caleb looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Martha Ellison, at this complicated, powerful, grieving, stubborn woman who had caused her real harm and was now standing on a ranch road asking to make it right, and she made the only decision she could make because she was who she was. Come inside, Hannah said. I have coffee on. Martha stayed an hour. It was not a comfortable hour exactly. There were long silences and careful sentences and moments where you could feel all three of them navigating something that didn't have an established path. But it was honest, which was better than comfortable. Martha told them toward the end that she had spoken to Walt Heller. That she had told him plainly that the pressure on his account had been of her making and not of anything Mrs. Whitaker had done, and that going forward his business relationship with the Mercer household was his to manage without interference. He seemed relieved, Martha said. He would be, Hannah said. He didn't want to do it. Most people don't want to do unkind things, Martha said. They just want someone to give them permission to stop. She looked at her coffee cup. I stopped giving them the other kind. When the carriage left, Hannah stood at this kitchen window and watched it go. Caleb came and stood beside her, not touching, just there. That was unexpected, he said. Yes, she said. How do you feel? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. Like a door opened that I'd stopped expecting to open, she said. I'm not sure yet what's on the other side, but I'm not afraid to look. He nodded. She went back to the stove. September came, and the heat finally genuinely broke. Not all at once. It never went all at once out here. It retreated the way it arrived in degrees, ceding ground slowly, and only when it had no choice. But one morning Hannah came out to find the air cool enough to make her take a sharp breath, and that was the morning she stood on the porch and understood that something had changed for good. The ranch had changed with them. She had not set out to change it. She had set out simply to live in it, honestly, to bring what she had and do what she knew, and not minimize herself to fit a space she hadn't made for herself. But living honestly has its own effect on a place. Windows that stayed open let the air move through. A kitchen that smelled like food every morning changed the quality of the mornings. A garden that was tended changed the look of the south yard. Pete had started coming by the kitchen in the evenings. Not to intrude, he was a private man, but for coffee, and occasionally for the particular kind of quiet company that forms between people who work alongside each other and have stopped needing to explain themselves. Denny had mostly stopped talking so much, which Hannah took as a sign of comfort, rather than distance people stop performing when they feel at home. Reyes had planted a second irrigation line without being asked from the pump to the back corner of the north pasture where the grass was thinnest. The ranch hands had decided something she understood. They had watched and waited and made their judgment, and their judgment was favorable, and that mattered to her more than the town's reversal, because it had not been compelled by anything except what they saw. Dale Purvis came to the ranch on the first cool Friday in September. He came without his wagon on foot, which meant he had walked the 2 miles from town, which meant he had wanted to come badly enough to do it the hard way. Hannah saw him from the kitchen window before Caleb did, and stood watching him come up the road. He knocked. She opened the door. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. His hat was in his hands, and his big blacksmith's face was working through an expression that didn't have an easy name. I wanted to... He stopped, started again. "I've got a hinge pin for your barn door, the old one." He held it out. "I made it 2 months ago. I should have brought it then. I didn't, and that was a poor decision on my part, and I'm sorry for it." Hannah looked at the hinge pin. She looked at Dale Purvis. She took the hinge pin. "Thank you, Dale," she said. "Do you want coffee?" He blinked. Yes, ma'am, if it's no trouble." "It's no trouble," she said, and stepped back to let him in. She heard Caleb's footstep in the hall behind her, and didn't turn around. She could feel from the quality of his stillness that he was watching, and she could feel from that stillness that he understood what this was, not just a hinge pin, not just a cup of coffee, and that he was letting her handle it because it was hers to handle, and he knew that. She put the coffee on. The evening that turned out to be the one she would carry for the rest of her life came on an ordinary Tuesday, 6 weeks into fall. She had not been marking things as significant. She had learned in the years since Thomas died that significant things rarely announce themselves. They arrive in the form of ordinary evenings, and you only understand what they were when you look back at them from a distance. She and Caleb were on the porch after supper. The air had the particular quality of early fall evenings, cool but not cold. The heat of the day still faintly present in the boards under their feet, the sky going the deep blue that comes just before the stars decide to appear all at once. Ember was in the north pasture. She could hear him moving in the dusk, the particular sound of a healthy young horse moving through grass. Caleb was in the chair beside her. He had a cup in his hand, and his legs were stretched out, and his face was the face of a man who is, without making a production of it, at rest. "I have something to ask you," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at his cup for a moment, then at her. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because it's the correct thing after all this, not because it solves a practical problem, because I want to." He paused. "I want to know that you're going to be on this porch tomorrow evening, and the one after that. I want to know we're building towards something with a real name on it." Hannah held his gaze. She thought about what she would have said to this 6 months ago in the cabin, in the thin summer before Ember, and before the fence, and before any of it. She thought about the woman who had watched a stranger dig a grave on her creek bank and stepped forward without knowing why, only knowing that something true was about to be buried, and she could not let it happen. She thought about what she had told that small black Colt at the stove in the dark, when no one was listening, and she didn't know if it would work. "You had a hard beginning. That doesn't mean you get a short story." Yes, she said. Simple. Clear. Without condition or qualification, because she had examined this from every angle, the way she examined everything, and the answer was the same from all of them. Caleb's face did the thing. It sometimes did, that small controlled shift that was his version of what other men expressed with great noise. His jaw settled. His shoulders dropped a half-inch. Something behind his eyes went warm and stayed warm. He reached over and took her hand. They sat in the falling dark and listened to Ember moving through the north pasture, steady and unhurried and alive. After a while, Hannah said, "The east fence line still needs work." "I know," Caleb said, "and the irrigation on the south quarter is running shallow." "I know that too. And Denny is going to need to learn to actually close the barn gate rather than just pushing it." "Hannah." She stopped. "Tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. At the honest, quiet, surviving face of this man who had ridden out one July morning to bury something, and had, because a woman on a creek bank had refused to let him come home with something entirely different. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She looked out at the pasture where Ember was a dark shape moving through darker grass under a sky filling fast with stars. And she thought about July, the dry creek bed, the flour sack, the 53 minutes, the small gasp that had changed everything. Nothing in that story had been easy. Nothing in it had been given. Every piece of it had been worked for, or fought for, or held on to, through the kind of quiet daily stubbornness that doesn't look like courage but is the deepest kind, and every piece of it had been worth it. Some things are not broken beyond repair. Some hearts are not past saving. Some lives that look like they've gone cold and still are only waiting for someone with enough sense and enough nerve to look past the appearance of the thing and see what's actually true. Not dead. Only cold. And with the right hands and enough warmth and the refusal to give up before the last moment has passed, breathing again. Fully, finally, and for good.